Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Engaging Virtual Delivery. My name is Kat Duco, and I'm the Marketing and Business Development Manager at the Myers-Briggs Company. I work alongside a team of key account managers to support our customers across the Asia-Pacific region. We'd like this to be an interactive webinar, and I'll be assisting with questions and comments throughout, but due to the large number of participants, we'll keep everyone on mute to avoid any background noise. So please participate using the questions box feature on your GoToWebinar side panel. Before we get started, I'll quickly introduce you to the Myers-Briggs Company. Our mission is to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. And we deliver on our mission through various approaches, including our consulting services, research services, certification training, and our range of assessments. Our goal is to maximize the performance of leaders, teams, and organizations through the use of our psychometric tools and professional services. And sharing our expertise is also part of what we do as a B Corp, which is a movement we're incredibly proud to be a part of. Being a B Corp is about putting a focus on our environment, people, and the community around us as part of everything we do. It's a fairly new concept, but one that's gaining a huge momentum as employees increasingly want to work in places that align with their personal values. So we do encourage you all to learn more about it. Today's webinar will run for about an hour and will be facilitated by Dr. Martin Boult, Senior Director of Professional Services and Psychologist at the Myers-Briggs Company. Martin has extensive experience working with organizations across the Asia-Pacific region in areas including team effectiveness, executive leadership development, organizational change, virtual training solutions, workplace well-being, and resilience. He's also our lead assessment certification trainer. Today, Martin will be sharing tips for adapting in-person classroom events and designing successful virtual events. And with that, I will turn you over to Martin.
Thanks, Kat, and hello to everyone who's joined our webinar today. Obviously, we're going to be talking about how to facilitate virtually, and so I thought I'd start with more introducing myself via the video. I'm not going to leave my video camera on the whole time, but obviously something that is important about building an environment online and with virtual learning and facilitation is that you can actually see people in an animated format rather than just the static picture. And I'll talk a bit more about how we found the use of video as helpful for virtual facilitation. But as there's a lot of content that we're going to move through, I won't leave my webcam on the whole time. I'll bring it in and out and show you how I might use it as part of our virtual facilitation. So welcome, and as Kat mentioned, the purpose of today's session is also to make it interactive in terms of showing you how we might engage an audience or participants in virtual facilitation. So be ready for some questions that we pose to you, and we welcome you sharing your responses and thoughts as we go through. I wanted to start here because when we've been thinking about learning in a virtual environment, it's obviously become even more salient in our current circumstances where more of us are working remotely, and indeed learning at all ages is starting to happen in a more virtual setting. And here's an example of one of my children, my daughter Charlotte, who during the whole COVID pandemic with the switch to virtual learning, she's in fact learning her piano now virtually with her teacher online. And it's just a reminder for me that there's many different ways that people are being encouraged or expected to both learn in a virtual format, but also teach and present in a virtual format. So let's start with some key questions this webinar is really going to focus in on. And I'll invite everyone just to take a moment to think of your thoughts or answers to the questions that are on screen. And I won't ask you at this point to share your response, more use it as an opportunity to think about how you would respond to these questions and what they mean for you. So what is most important for virtual facilitators to be effective? So what's going to help you feel to be an effective virtual facilitator? How can virtual facilitation support your participants' learning? And how can virtual learning support individual and group development, which is obviously part of what our business offers to clients, but I'm sure many of you are involved in the same kind of objective of helping individuals and groups learn from your sessions. Now, I have started our session today by posing these questions at the beginning of the learning event, and be it a virtual or in-person learning event, we found it helpful to start the session with questions to engage everyone's attention early on, and that does become important for keeping attention throughout a virtual learning session. And in actual fact, keeping attention becomes even more important in a virtual environment where there is a temptation for participants or the audience to get easily distracted. So we'll talk more about how we can help support that attentional engagement throughout. So we are working and supporting organisations locally and internationally with their development objectives, and drawing on our experience of designing and facilitating virtual learning, as well as delivering our consulting in a more virtual way. We've had to do more of that very rapidly in our current environment. And the topics we're looking at today is really based on our experience as well as research that has been undertaken so far in this era of relatively widely dispersed use of virtual learning and training. So we'll touch on mindsets that we as the presenters or facilitators need to be aware of when we engage with virtual delivery. We'll look at some technology and how to best incorporate that and use that. Designing your virtual event. Also things for you as the facilitator or presenter to be mindful of before your virtual session. We'll talk about how to engage an audience during that learning experience, as well as helping your participants transition from the virtual learning environment into applying it in reality after your session. So first, we're going to invite everyone to think about your views or perceptions or even beliefs about shifting from being an in-person facilitator to a virtual facilitator. And on the screen there, I've got a question that we're posing to you all, to then feel free to provide your answers in the chat response function. And really for you to share with us, it could be a word, it could be a sentence, a phrase. What are your hopes and fears about moving from in-person to virtual facilitation? And so if you'd like to take a moment to start sharing those thoughts. And this is one way of starting to draw in where your participants also in a learning scenario would be with the content that you're presenting. So I might start to see in a moment, I'll invite Kat to share with us what are some of the responses, but maybe to also keep top of mind today as we go through our webinar and think about live virtual training. When we're talking about live virtual training with the facilitator and participants interacting on the same live learning event, this is known or described these days as synchronous training. There is also the possibility of virtual learning through an asynchronous approach, and this refers to self-directed online learning like watching recorded lectures or reading notes. So while asynchronous learning can support development, today we're really going to focus on the synchronous approach, where you as the facilitator and your participants are engaged in the same event at the same time. So Kat, what sort of responses have come through that people are sharing about their hopes and fears of virtual facilitation?
We've got a lot of responses coming through, so I know I won't be able to get to them all, but I'll read off a handful here. So can't gauge the audience, hoping that they can still energize and engage the audience. It could be less fun, lack of connection, creating a positive interactive experience, lack of audience participation, not seeing reactions, greater access for everyone to engage in effective learning regardless of where they're based. So there's actually a lot around engagement.
Great, excellent. Well, firstly, thank you everyone for sharing your responses, and Kat for capturing the initial ones there. And I can definitely hear it's a combination of some questions or wariness about how do we engage people in this virtual learning environment, And I think also highlighting some people have also identified there might be some further opportunities that virtual learning and facilitation offers. So let's do a bit of a reality check of what we do and don't know about virtual learning and facilitation. And despite claims I have heard recently from some people, or certainly reading online, that nearly everyone is using virtual learning, in reality, it's still a relatively new experience for most people. Even with the recent growing use of digital technology in education and business in the last 15 to 20 years, if we really think about the history of humanity, human beings have been around for over 200,000 years, and therefore virtual training is a brand new way to learn, and research is still being done to confirm what's effective or ineffective with virtual learning. So we're really living during a time of experimentation with virtual learning. So that's important to keep in mind for ourselves as facilitators of virtual learning, as well as maybe prompting that with our participants, that our virtual sessions are really pioneering in many ways, and it'll give everyone opportunities to learn what is effective with virtual sessions, and also what may be less effective or not as helpful. What we do know already, though, is virtual learning is providing opportunities for people who previously had limited capacity to participate in certain in-person learning events. For example, geography might be the challenge for people to be able to travel to a training venue, or time needed to meet to get to an in-person venue. And indeed, there comes with some expense of having to host training in an in-person way. However, virtual learning is not a panacea or a magic solution for all learning needs. And I think that's something we all do have to keep in mind also. There is some knowledge, skills, and perspectives that really is just better learned in an in-person learning experience. For example, a musician cannot easily learn all that is needed for playing their musical instrument competently, confidently, and with finesse just by watching another person online. Or a tennis player still can learn a lot about tennis techniques by watching and learning through an online method. However, at some point, the tennis player has to get out onto the court and hit a ball with another person, or be coached in person in the moment. Now, if we think about learning for our workplace, and in the example where we do a lot of work with leadership development, a leader can learn much about the principles of leadership from virtual learning, but the meaningful learning about what constitutes effective leadership really comes about from the experience of interacting with people and actually leading people. So a starting point for when you're thinking about virtual learning is what can realistically be achieved through online or virtual learning experience. Virtual facilitation will involve building new skills on our behalf as the facilitators, as well as trying new approaches for both facilitator and participants. It's also an opportunity for everyone to develop themselves, and I found it helpful when I was starting to do virtual presentations to reflect on what I was learning from each session, and also to discuss that with other colleagues who were using virtual methods, because it helped me clarify what I thought was working or maybe not working. And virtual and in-person training sessions are still only part of the overall learning experience we're offering to people. So keep in mind what other learning approaches your participants will benefit from outside of your virtual sessions. For example, some of the asynchronous virtual learning, such as self-directed reading or watching video clips, journaling, can also add to your virtual learning sessions. So what I did note is a big step for many people, particularly if they haven't done much virtual facilitation or if they're just starting to embark on it, is really the mindset of the facilitator. And on screen here, I have some key questions maybe for you to reflect on and think about your own beliefs about virtual facilitation, particularly if you're starting to switch from in-person to virtual. So what are your expectations for yourself as both a designer and facilitator of virtual learning? And are these expectations realistic, or are they maybe more fantasy? Are you expecting too much of yourself as a virtual facilitator? What experience and skills from in-person training that you have can you draw on that you could bring into virtual delivery? So think about what other people have told you you're really good at doing as an in-person trainer. For example, your knowledge of the subject, your ability to present and respond to questions from participants, or your teaching stories and anecdotes. All these strengths and things that you have developed for your in-person still become relevant and really helpful and important for virtual facilitation. And the next question, what are you actually gaining and what are you letting go of as you transition into virtual facilitation? So some things that you could be gaining is new experience and skills of helping others learn through virtual training, or saving travel time and venue costs and reaching a wider audience that's not limited by geography, or even increasing the range of clients and participants that you can work with in a virtual medium. It's also worth acknowledging that you may be giving up observing people directly in the training room, and I think that came through in some of your responses you were sharing today. And also being able to see people's reactions in the moment. These are things you can't always easily do with virtual training. So we do need to accept that there are going to be some aspects of learning in a virtual format that we cannot expect to have the same as an in-person learning, particularly some of the interpersonal dynamics. So help your clients think of ways they can apply their learning with others after your session if your concerns are about how do they do that learning with each other in the session. And ultimately, our mindset will influence how confident and how comfortable we are demonstrating to our participants how we are using virtual learning. And some of you will probably be aware with the concept of fixed and growth mindsets. So I guess something to maybe ask yourself is, do you have a fixed mindset towards virtual facilitation, as in you're not able to learn new tricks? Or do you have a growth mindset towards virtual facilitation, that this is an opportunity for you to build and develop new skills and new talents through the experience of trying the virtual medium? If you're new to virtual facilitation or have limited experience, what I would encourage you to do is avoid having expectations of yourself to be perfect, especially the first few times you deliver virtual sessions. What I found helpful is to aim for optimal rather than perfect. I find it helpful to remind myself about the 80-20 rule to help focus on what level of competence to aim for initially. So if you feel at least 80% across the skills and knowledge that's needed for virtual delivery, you should have some confidence it's going to work. As the phrase goes, every master was once a disaster. We only get better by more and more experience with it. So take a moment to have a look on the screen here and consider the different skills and knowledge for the virtual facilitation. In this pyramid of skills, the base level skills are more about the tactical and technical knowledge and skills, such as how confident we are using technical features of the online platform. Whereas the higher level skills in the pyramid are more about our individual facilitation skills and experience. So have a think about which level skills you're most motivated to address or work on, and then what will take more time for you to feel comfortable. Avoid trying to feel that you need to learn every aspect of these skills all at once. In fact, it helps to break out which parts of the pyramid you're ready to first start developing. Now, turning to the technology of virtual learning and facilitation. And what I did want to say in this session is not to pinpoint necessarily which online platform to use or which ones are the best. I think a lot of that has to do with what are you trying to achieve with your learning and how do you want to work with your participants. But from our experience, we find online training software platforms need to meet what will support the virtual training and also what's easy for you to use as a facilitator and easy for your participants to use and access. So some useful and important features to look for when you're deciding which online platform to use. First of all is the capacity for the presenter and participants to use video. As I mentioned earlier, it's an important way of building connection and socializing the learning experience. We also regularly use chat functions where people can pose questions or share thoughts, much like you did earlier in our session. Breakout rooms is an important feature, particularly if you're planning small group work or where people can work with each other on assigned tasks and activities during your training. Live polls and surveys are a great way of engaging your audience. And also we've found many online platforms are now offering more interactive tools for participants through the use of virtual whiteboards where they can contribute their thoughts or add to the session where everyone can see the contributions. Another thing which is not necessarily a platform feature but really important still with virtual learning is allowing time for individual or solo work. So the icons on the screen are really representing some symbols that we use and embed in our virtual sessions so participants know what activity or what feature we're using during each part of the program. And then thinking about how we design and put our virtual learning events together is crucial to ensuring that we have a successful learning event. So before designing your virtual sessions, I found it really important to clarify with the client or the people who I'm teaching what it is that they actually want to learn or develop. And is it in fact possible to learn that through a virtual training? So get really clear about realistic expectations from your clients. Some learning will need to be undertaken outside the virtual session, such as practicing coaching skills or team collaboration. These are things that you can set the groundwork and the foundation for in a virtual event, but you really need to clarify the expectation with your participants or clients that they need to continue that application beyond the virtual session. That means participants need to be committed to putting the learning and skills into practice, but that's really no different to an in-person learning event either. The next key point is keep learning objectives in mind when you're designing content and activities for virtual learning. So avoid using an online platform feature like a survey or a poll just because it's there. Overusing these kind of features can lead to distraction or even dilute the important content you're wanting your participants to focus on. Also keep in mind, facilitators and participants of virtual training are using a lot more attentional and cognitive effort to engage and be present in the session. And in many ways, we've found from research we're using more attentional effort than an in-person session. So think about your experiences of being part of online virtual training in the past. At what point in the session did you find it difficult to pay attention or to not be distracted by something else like messages on your phone or checking your email? So in essence, don't attempt to try and replicate a live in-person learning event the same way you might run it virtually. For example, if you previously run workshops that last a whole day in person, that can be quite unrealistic for people to pay attention for an entire day online. So one way you might want to do that is reconfigure your full day workshop into 4 2-hour sessions that could be delivered online at different points. But keep in mind, for sessions this long, you'll also need to allow frequent stretch breaks. And I often allocate a stretch break, be it a physical stand up and stretch on the spot, through to a longer break where people can refresh every 30 minutes or so. So plan to have pauses and check-ins where participants are invited to respond to questions or answer a poll or even participate in an activity. Also be ready for and allow 5 to 10 seconds of silence after asking a question or inviting comments. That was something I learned very early on that was very different to in-person training, where often an answer could be posed, presented back to a question that I asked very quickly. So really give that opportunity to pause and reflect, where people can either type in a response or provide a verbal response, and just accepting that there is going to be silent pauses along the way. And where possible, schedule interactive moments with participants every 15 to 20 minutes to keep them engaged with the session. Virtual sessions should also provide for activities where participants are working on individual and group activities. So don't expect it all to be about learning within groups. It's really important to give people opportunities to record their own thoughts and responses, as well as participating with others. When it comes to using the particular platform that you choose, plan and test using it in the design phase of your session. So rather than go live with a new online feature, such as a poll, test the poll out in the design phase and even test it out with some volunteers to see how it actually works for you. And also, in the end, technology is as reliable as it possibly can, but there's invariably going to be some situations or times when it won't meet all our objectives or technology does fail. So during my first attempts of facilitating online, I frantically tried to fix some technical problems while remaining on camera. So unless you're certain that it will be a quick fix, it's best to post a message on the chat box or say to people if their audio isn't working, that you're facing some tech problems and that you offer a 5-minute break. Of course, if you're offering a 5-minute break, include a timestamp of when that break is commencing. So if you are indicating you're going to take a 5-minute break to fix a technical issue and it's 5:55, make it clear that that was the start of the 5 minutes so people are ready to come back within 5 minutes. And in my experience, I found that 5 minutes is usually enough time to restart a platform, restart a laptop, or contact online support to get things corrected. Now, before you actually launch into your live session virtually, it's really important that you do have some comfort and confidence, and that's where I really strongly recommend practicing your presentation, but also practice using some of the activities. For participants, we found it's really important in preparing them that you provide succinct briefing information about the session, how to join, and what they can expect from their participation. I know I was previously invited to an online learning event a while back, and I got a 2-page email with very detailed instructions, but it was almost overwhelming. So think about what's the minimum must-know information you want to provide to your participants ahead of the session. And also asking your participants to do some preparation before the live virtual event is a useful way of engaging them early on in the session. It helps to be clear with them what will enable them to have a positive experience during the virtual session. So I often make it clear to participants to choose a space where they don't encounter distractions. For example, not to join the virtual session when they're sitting in a room full of their family members, or where dirty dishes in the kitchen can be seen behind them when they've got their video on. Or equally, not to sit on their bed or a couch where they could easily fall asleep. So encourage participants to take their learning seriously by finding an environment where they can concentrate and not be distracted or distract others while they're going through. Now we get to the actual engaging part of the live virtual session. And here on screen, I've got some key points that we found really essential in any virtual learning. So the aim for you and your participants really is to join ahead of the start time. We often encourage our participants to join at least 15 minutes before the live session so that they can test out their technology and you can handle any questions about connectivity ahead of time. That saves you having to address those issues before or whilst you're in your live session and losing valuable learning time. The second point is about technology and having difficulties with it. So what can be helpful is appoint someone, if you have a colleague, who could be like a help desk person to assist participants who might have difficulties with technology during your session or if they become disconnected. And that can be important, particularly if you are not in a position to address those technical difficulties as the facilitator. Or if you are having to run it as a solo trainer, then what I suggest doing is at the beginning of your session, give some clear instructions or directions what to do if a participant does get disconnected or is not able to join a session easily. And this is probably a bit like the kind of instructions we give in an in-person learning event about the fire evacuation. So brief people ahead of time what to do in the event that technological challenges occur. Now, with virtual facilitation, signposting is really important because we don't have our audience in the room with us. And signposting should be both verbal and visual. So explain what you're asking your participants to do during a session, and also give them some warning. So if you're going to pose a question to your group, let them know in a few moments you're going to have a chance to respond to a question. And also point out verbally and visually any resources you want them to refer to during the session. So as part of many of our training and learning events, we're providing some additional hard copy resources. It could be a booklet, it could be a handout. And rather than just say now in the handout or book, I will often show it or demonstrate it on screen or visually so all participants know what we're referring to. This is something that you don't have the access to like you would in an in-person event where you can see what people are picking up on the table. Then to build trust in the group, which is really important, it can be useful to help the group members better understand and learn from each other, but also feel comfortable with each other. If you're working with an audience who haven't previously met, we often find it helpful to ask them to send a photo of themselves along with preparing some introductory questions or responding to questions that allow them to introduce themselves. And those video or photos actually help build some rapport and engagement amongst the group members before they arrive at the session. It also means it's easier to build some of that interpersonal connection as part of your virtual session. Then when it comes to building in activities and interaction in your workshops, it's really important to build some interaction early on, particularly in the first quarter of each session. So pose questions to the group for them to respond to or relate to the topic that you're presenting on at the beginning of the session. So before anything is being taught by way of learning content, if your session was about leadership, you might ask the group to share at the beginning what challenges do leaders in their organisation face? Or if it's about different personality styles, how do different personality types respond to change? Then when we're thinking about keeping people's attention, it's important to schedule activities regularly throughout your virtual session. So where possible, avoid more than 15 minutes or longer of presenting content. That can start to fall into passive learning. And if you're planning a session that goes longer than 60 to 90 minutes, also build in physical and mental stretch breaks. And as I mentioned earlier, we aim for those physical and mental stretch breaks approximately every 30 minutes, just to allow people's minds to re-engage with the content after a short break. And if you're facilitating larger group sessions, I really find it important to have a colleague to support you by being a producer role. And the person in the producer role can assist with collating written questions that might be posed by the group, or organising virtual breakout groups and responding to technical difficulties. A second voice also from a co-producer also helps to keep participants' attention. It's a bit like how Kat and I have been working today. Having two people dealing with and interacting with the group can help keep that level of engagement so they're hearing a different voice. We've also found it helpful to have that producer or supporter role, particularly in sessions where we're sharing a lot of information with participants, such as results from assessments or personality measures they might have taken. So rather than you as the facilitator having to organise and distribute all those reports, it's good if there is a helper that you've got who can help issue those materials at the relevant times in a session. In the end, it's about setting a climate for your learners about what's going to work for them. And one of the ways I also build in the expectation of participation is to ask participants to refrain from responding to emails or text questions during a virtual event, much like you'd expect them to do so in an in-person event. And if your virtual session involves participants sharing their experiences or challenges, it will be important to help build a safe, open, and friendly virtual learning environment. And this doesn't easily or automatically occur in a virtual session without offering some ways of building that safety amongst the participants. So as I mentioned earlier, an important step for building that trust amongst them is to allow interactions that go beyond superficial introductory exchanges, such as asking people to not just share what their current job is, but something important or personal to them. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things we do is invite participants to send a photo of themselves in and to share what's important about that picture with the group. And that starts to build a safer, open, and friendly learning environment. When it comes to actually facilitating activities, we've found that it's really crucial to establish expectations about participation. And as facilitators, we all face the problem of silence at some point during a class or during discussions, or the opposite, where some activities or sessions may be dominated by a few of the participants. So one approach I use to encourage participation in activities and assignments is I make it clear at the beginning of the session to the audience that I have all the participants' names on a piece of paper in a bucket or a jar, and I'm going to draw out a person's name as we go through the session, and they'll be invited or asked to provide a response to a key question. So that can be a helpful way of keeping your participants listening and following, because they need to be ready for when their name might be drawn out of the jar. And also the participants' anticipation of having their name pulled out of the jar can be less scary than directly calling on people in a virtual learning environment. It's also important to provide verbal and visual instructions for using platform tools. So don't assume that all your participants know how to use a feature of the online platform. So what we found is bring those instructions for each feature, such as a breakout group or a poll, just before the activity itself to remind them, your participants, how to use it or how to engage in it. And whilst virtual learning is something that you're trying to build interaction around, it's also crucial to allow time for reflection. So the longer programs that we run, we make the point that there will be opportunities for participants to work independently or what we call solo activities. But just because they're working solo doesn't mean that there can't be any shared learning. So I set the expectation that after each solo activity, participants will be invited or asked to share what they have recorded or what their key learning insights are. But that solo time allows for the digestion of the learning and the important reflection on the learning. And of course, in addition to balancing the solo and reflection time, we also know from research in adult learning that socializing the learning is crucial to helping people build their understanding as well as gain new insights. So this is where breakout groups, online breakout groups of 2 to 5 people can be really powerful ways of helping your participants use the material or the content that you're presenting and learn from each other. This kind of social interaction is even more important when participants are not physically co-located, such as in a training room with each other, as it's likely to be the case in our current work environment where we're all having to interact and work more online and remotely. But when using breakout groups, be really clear about what each breakout group needs to work on and what you're asking them to report back on to the larger group. And also set the expectation that breakout groups are helping other groups to learn by sharing back and reporting back. The other way we can build in the interaction and engagement through a live session is to use the tools such as a virtual whiteboard, where participants can contribute either by drawing, typing, or indicating with icons key things on the screen in front of the group for everyone to share. And one way we use this is when we're running sessions using the Myers-Briggs type indicator and people have identified which personality type is most accurate for them, is we invite them on the live virtual screen and whiteboard to type in their name or to share their thoughts about what's the material that's been represented on the screen. So here's an example simply of how we would capture some of that information and invite participants to type their name in the MBTI type that fits best for them. So as I mentioned earlier, adult learning principles really draw on the importance of socializing the learning as part of your virtual session. And just because your session is run virtually or online doesn't mean that the socializing and participant learning is any less important or necessary for making sense of learning and its relevance to their context. So while there are some obvious limits with virtual training compared to in-person sessions about that socializing, such as not being in the same room with each other or seeing each other's faces beyond a video screen, it is still important and possible to engage opportunities for your participants to learn with and from each other. So set the expectation that small group work in breakout sessions works best when all participants are using their video as part of their discussion. This should be communicated before your virtual session, so it's not a surprise for people when they arrive at your training. And also be mindful not to expect participants to have their video on through all large group sessions. That can be quite draining for some people to have their face filmed the whole way through. And indeed, for you as a facilitator, much like I've been doing today, is pick your moments when you want to be online or demonstrating your video, how you appear on video. But also be clear where you're asking participants to use video. And set the expectation that all groups will need to share or report back to the larger group either immediately after a breakout exercise or at a later point in the session. And this is where, if you have a lunch break, it can be useful to ask the breakout groups to share after a lunch break when they've all had more of a chance to reflect and digest. Also builds in opportunities where the group can pose questions and challenges to each other and use that shared group learning experience much like you would in an in-person event. So just to give you a flavour of some ways that we would still run group learning activities, which is possible in a virtual learning environment. Much of our work is working with leaders, helping them learn from other leaders or the people they're leading, as well as team development, where you're helping members of teams work with each other. And when we're setting these online activities up with each other, we're making it very clear that we want individuals and the group to capture the learning and insights that they gain from each of these activities and to be ready to share back with the group what they're going to do differently as a result of the learning. So one of the activities we look at is exploring and negotiating differences based on personality type preferences. Some of you will be aware of the MBTI measures people's preferences for either extraversion or introversion. So one example of how we run a group activity around this is after you have identified with your participants what their preferences are, either for extraversion or introversion, is we then allocate them to virtual breakout groups of people with the same preferences. So we'd have breakout groups or rooms with people who share the extroverted preference, and then other breakout groups or rooms with people who prefer the introverted preference. And here you can see on screen one of the questions that we use in a virtual session around this. What does your ideal work environment look like? So in those breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, I ask participants to come up either in words or descriptions, or if they care to on the virtual whiteboard, to draw what their ideal work environment looks like. And then you invite them to report back by bringing all the breakout groups back into the large group session. And it works exceptionally well. Of course, having shared those different perspectives with each other, to avoid it being just a interesting learning exercise or even an academic one that may not be used, this is where the reflection piece becomes important as part of your live virtual session. So ask your participants, after they've heard from all the groups, what is it that they observed or heard that was important learning for them? And in the case of extroversion, introversion, how might the differences that they heard or shared relate to communication challenges, but also what are some things that they're going to do differently or are now aware of about how they use that learning material with each other. So having done video and interactive activities in breakout groups, this is where it can be helpful to switch to people sharing their thoughts in a more reflective way to allow for that introverted time. So this is where I might ask participants to share their responses through the chat function as opposed to verbally. So to role model this just for a moment, and I might invite everyone who's joined our webinar today, if you could share in the chat box either a word, a phrase, one learning that you've picked up from our webinar so far that is either important for you or that you think would be helpful for you. And to really demonstrate the importance of giving that time to reflect and then allow people to write the answers, I am literally going to pause here for a moment like I would in a live session and say, take a moment to record your thoughts of what's important or helpful for you in the chat box. And when we've got some answers coming through, I'll invite Kat to share back. But expect a few seconds of silence here as I allow people to do that solo work. And if you're working in a virtual environment, it does help to just acknowledge that everyone's still connected by providing a few verbal points, not new learning, but just letting people know that you're still there and they're still there, as silence in a virtual online session can actually feel like it goes for an eternity. So hopefully now we're starting to get some responses coming through the chat box, and I might check in with Kat. What sort of things have been coming up for people as important or helpful learning so far?
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback coming through. So some have said being prepared, verbal and visual signposting, breaking it down into digestible chunks, good preparation and planning, physical stretching, regular mental and physical breaks, and there's a lot more here. So I'm wary of time, so I won't share everybody's.
Sure, but thanks again for everyone engaging and sharing your thoughts there. As you can see, it wasn't a hugely long period of time that I'm asking people to reflect and do that solo piece, but it's enough time for people to stop and pause and say, what have I learned, and then to share it back again through that chat function. And again, thank you all for sharing your responses. It sounds like we're getting quite a few more than we can actually cover in the time we have. So again, as a facilitator, encourage and find ways for your participants to grab the learning that they're picking up and applying it into negotiated agreements or actions with each other. So as I will go through each activity, and in the example I showed you one there for extraversion, introversion, if you're doing more activities around a personality type model or multiple activities, what I really find helpful is at the end of each activity, ask your participants to do that solo work, reflect, and then share what did you learn from that. Also, at the end of your session, really important to lead your group in developing their learning into action plans. And again, here is one way you can do this. It works both in an in-person format as well as a virtual format, but it's really helping participants define and narrow down what is something that they individually will be committing to, And if it's a team scenario, what are some actions that the team collectively agrees to, or the group agrees to commit to? And then what I would encourage is allowing time in your virtual session where that sharing of those commitments actually occurs, and also giving some time reference points about when they will check in with each other to see if they've acted on their learning. You can also suggest having a follow-up session with your participants, and I often try and set that up a couple of weeks after the virtual learning event, really to say there's an opportunity to check progress or address any ongoing challenges. This is what I find helps people connect their virtual learning into reality. So we started our session with these 3 key questions today. And I'm hoping that from our webinar, you've got a sense of some ways you can prepare yourself, and also what might be important for helping you feel prepared to be an effective virtual facilitator. Also, what's going to be important for your audience, your participants, when they're learning in a virtual environment, and also how you can support both individual as well as group development. And we do have more tips and information to help you work in a more virtual learning environment and facilitating. And as people who've joined our webinar today, you might be able to find that we're making available some tips sheets. One of the tip sheets relates to how you can develop, design, and facilitate virtual learning, keeping personality type preferences in mind, as well as tips on how you might facilitate giving feedback when you're having to do that in a remote or virtual format. And Kat, what would be the best way of people accessing this information?
So there's a couple ways that you can get to it. We have included these 2 resources in the Handouts section of the GoToWebinar side panel, so you can access it very easily that way. They're also available on our website, and I'll highlight where that is in just a moment. We will be taking questions in a few moments as well, which you can submit through the questions box on the GoToWebinar side panel. And while we wait for those to come through, I'll share a bit more information about our company, including resources for virtual teams that are available through our website. So for those of you that are new to the Myers-Briggs company, we work with our clients in a few different ways. We do offer consulting services where one of our experienced consultants like Martin can get to know your organization and design and deliver a customized solution to meet your business requirements. We can also partner with you and be as involved in your projects as you want us to be, whether that's co-facilitating development programs or helping you behind the scenes with designing your talent development strategy. Or if you want to manage all aspects of design and delivery yourself, you can join our assessment certification programs to gain the knowledge and tools that you need to build that capability internally. We're most well known for the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but we do have tools to support the entire talent lifecycle, including emotional intelligence tools, leadership 360s, and talent selection tools. So if you want more information about our assessments and services, our website is a great place to start. And I do want to call special attention to our new web pages with resources specific for the virtual workforce. From our home page, you can click on the second banner, which looks like the one that appears on the screen here, to navigate to the virtual workforce pages, which include information on virtual team building workshops and complementary resources like tip sheets, quick guides, infographics, including the handouts that we have highlighted here today. And also, you can find more free webinars to attend. Our next free webinar is going to be on July 1st on the topic of the psychology of change, and it'll be facilitated by Cameron Knott, psychologist and managing director of the Myers-Briggs company. Cameron will explore how and why people deal with change in different ways and how leaders can increase buy-in when they're implementing organizational change initiatives. So hopefully you can join us for that webinar or the resilience webinar as well. I do want to say that we will be sending the slides and recording from this webinar to each of you in the next couple of business days, hopefully by tomorrow. You'll also receive a link in the next hour to a brief online survey, which should just take you a couple minutes to complete. And we would really appreciate your feedback if you don't mind filling that out. So we'll move on to questions now, and I can see that a few have popped through. The first one, Martin, is what is the maximum group size that you would recommend for virtual training?
Yeah, okay, really good question. So the one thing I learned early on is that if you want to have your virtual sessions participative and people engaged in it, there is an optimal group size maximum. 10 to 15 is what I generally find as the optimal size. Once you get above 15, whilst you can deliver the session, it becomes harder to ensure that everyone's engaged in it or has opportunities, particularly if your sessions are 60 to 90 minutes in length as opposed to a whole day. Also, if you are planning on a larger group, really suggest you have that sort of two facilitate and produce a combination. But 10 to 15 seems to work really well.
Great, thanks. Another question.
Are there any other questions?
Can any activity... Oh, sorry, I think we might have a little delay here. Can any activity be adapted for a virtual setting?
Any is pretty broad, but what I would say is we found a number of the group activities that for many years we've run in person, and I think I showed an example of one relating to that extroversion, introversion, can be realigned or readapted for virtual learning. And I think that's where video also becomes important, as particularly if you're learning about different personality styles or interpersonal skills, for people to be able to see that through some video sharing is helpful. Of course, it's not the same as having everyone in the room together, but the learning, I do see participants walking away with the same kind of learning that they might otherwise expect from in-person learning. The only other really activities that probably don't translate as well is when people are having to get live feedback about something that they're demonstrating or a skill they're trying to pick up on. But those are sorts of things that can be done after a virtual learning session.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And I know we're getting close on time here, so I'll do one more question. There's several questions coming through, so if we don't get to you, just know that we will be following up with everybody individually with the recording and the slides, and we'll also make sure we address your questions as well. And I do want to mention too that if you have anything in particular that you're working through, activities that you're wanting to use or adapt into a virtual setting, we can always set you up with a call with Martin or one of our other lead consultants so you can get some personalized advice as well.
Sure.
So one more question here that has come through is when there are breakout sessions, do you recommend joining the breakouts at different times to help groups work through tasks?
Yeah, that's a good one. So again, it's the length of the breakout that's probably important. If it's a 5-minute exercise, and if I have 5 breakout groups, for example, it can be difficult to make it around to all of them. But yes, longer breakout activities, some that have run, 20, 30 minutes, it's helpful to join or just check in with the group to see how they're going or pick up any questions. If you are planning on joining people's breakouts, though, make it clear before the breakouts begin that you are going to virtually visit and check in with them so they don't get a surprise. Because yeah, otherwise they might feel like they were getting a new member of the group that they weren't expecting, who's the facilitator. So yes, that can work quite well also.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And thank you all again for joining the webinar today. Again, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you and make sure we answer your question. And hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, Martin, for your presentation.
Thanks for joining. Thanks, Kat.
Bye, everyone.